All right, so as promised, this week we are going to talk about some really basic concepts that might seem basic, might not be totally obvious why we're talking about them, but it will become clear why we're talking about them, because in some sense these are sort of building blocks for trying to understand the more complicated problems that pertain to media politics. Okay, so namely, the concepts that we're going to try to talk about today are information, communication, intelligence, and rationality. So because these might seem like basic things that you might think you know what these things are, and it's not going to be immediately, you probably signed up for this class thinking, politics is the media. It means we're going to talk about like the effects of newspapers on people's political opinions. We'll talk a little bit about that stuff here and there, but that's not actually the gist of this course. The gist of this course is actually much more ambitious in a sense, much more general. So I want to kind of motivate what we're doing today, why we're talking about these concepts, and that's sort of the purpose of this first part of my talk. Okay, so the first point to kind of recognize is that it's not obvious at all what information and communication are exactly. I mean, think about it. Like, what exactly is a piece of information? Like, could you really explain to someone in a conversation what a piece of information is? Or, how do you know you're communicating to someone? It's easy to say, we communicate all the time. It's just talking, right? We just, we write each other messages, we talk, we have conversations. That's communicating. Everyone knows when they're communicating or not, right? That's kind of the quotidian way of thinking about it. But it's actually not true. That's not the case at all. It's not at all obvious. If or when you are actually communicating information to someone, right? And so you can immediately see the link between information and communication. I think on some very practical level we know this, right? Like when we have conversations with people, we try to express what we mean. Sometimes that it works better than it works sometimes better than others, right? That feeling of trying to communicate something to someone, and you walk away from the conversation feeling like you didn't communicate it, you didn't get it across. That's just one very kind of everyday example of the fact that communication is actually a very puzzling thing. Okay, we don't at all understand it from a kind of quotidian perspective. Hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you'll understand it a little bit better. But this is why we need to kind of ask some basic questions. Similar to communicating, how do you know if you're actually learning? Right. That's why we need to talk a little bit about intelligence and rationality. In some sense, learning is a kind of communication. It's receiving communication from the outside, and you can receive communications from the outside better or in better or worse or more correct or less correct ways. Just like you can understand someone talking to you, or you can fail to understand someone talking to you. Okay, so learning might seem separate from communicating, but actually all of these things revolve around information on some level. Learning is a process of taking in information from the world that you're interacting with. Generally, if you're really good at that, that's called being smart. If you're really bad at that, that's called being stupid in some broad sense. Okay, but we all use these words. We all have a sense of what these things mean, but what do they really mean technically? And how can you kind of link all of these concepts into one sort of unified framework in some sense? Okay, that's going to be one of the motivations here. The other big problem is that machines and systems can learn too. So we think about information processing. We think about communicating and learning. We think about these as very kind of anthropomorphic activities, right? We tend to think of these in a humanistic sense. What could be more humanistic than learning and reading books? This feels like a very human activity, but in fact, it's not at all. Machines can learn. Even immaterial systems can learn. So, take for instance a complex social system. The institutions that define how the energies and attentions in a society are distributed and organized, like capitalism, right? as kind of the broad name for the type of kind of civilization that we inhabit today. Well, civilization is capitalism is a complex system. It learns in some sense. In a very non-trivial sense, you can talk about immaterial systems having intelligence and learning. I mean, capitalism is an intelligent system. It is able to make decisions about where resources should be distributed across a much vaster complexity than any human being could possibly process. It's basically a kind of super organism. And there is a sense in which it absolutely has what you could call intelligence, and it absolutely engages in something like learning. Of course, machines also can do this. The term machine learning you might have heard of as a kind of a hip phrase today as part of trends in data science and what have you. You can teach computers to learn, right? Okay. So we need to figure that out. Because what if, in some sense, what if there's something smarter than us that is playing us? That might sound, kind of far out, and perhaps it is. But if you think about it, it's also quite reasonable and concrete. If it is true that machines can be intelligent, and if it is true that systems, immaterial kind of complex systems can legitimately be said to have a certain kind of intelligence or to manage a complexity that is greater than the complexity we can manage, then it suddenly becomes quite plausible that in fact there could very well be systems in the world that in fact, we like to think that we are controlling the systems around the world, but in fact perhaps there are systems that are more intelligent than us that are actually playing us in ways that we don't fully understand. I mean, in some sense, this, I think, is the basis for the most intelligent kind of critique of capitalism, which is that, it is a complex superorganism that, in fact, controls us in ways that we don't fully understand and that are perhaps not fully consistent with what we would all like, the ways that we would all like to be or to live. Okay? I mean, you've got to grant to capitalism that it's by far the most effective way for people to organize their productive relationships. There's basically no other competitor in the history of social systems, in terms of how to relate to how to organize a large number of people to produce a lot of stuff for large numbers of people. Capitalism is basically the best way we've ever known to do that. But how does it do that? How do you think it does that? It does that precisely by being more intelligent than we are. In some sense, it is literally more powerful than we are. It tells us what to do, in some sense. It tells you where you can get a job. It tells you where to move to get a job. It tells you what skills you should learn to get a job, to make money. So there, in these sort of super intelligent technological systems that in some sense they emerge from our creativity. In some sense, they emerge from human ingenuity. We create systems that actually evolve to become more intelligent than we are and then control us in ways that we don't fully understand. And that could very well be in contradiction to what we all want. Okay? So that's what I mean by this question of, what if something smarter than us is playing us? Basically, that is what I think is going on today. And I think that is basically the most simple and effective way to diagnose a whole slew of problems that define kind of contemporary politics. In my view, at least that's my hunch, or that's my hypothesis. And this is all just to motivate what we're going to talk about in the several slides to follow as I try to kind of back out this idea for you. Okay, but this is why we're talking about things like information, communication, intelligence, and rationality. It's because precisely all of these questions up here on this slide right now, if we have any chance of actually understanding these things, we need to understand more precisely what are, if we have any chance of answering these questions, we need to understand more precisely what exactly are even these concepts, which are not at all obvious to kind of most normal people who, don't take a class like this, right? Okay. hope that's sufficiently motivating as to why we're talking about what we're talking about. So, what is information then? The simplest summary of the idea of information that I've come across in my studies is a quote from the thinker Gregory Bateson. You could call him, he's sort of known as one of the big figures in what is called cybernetics, which is kind of mid 20th century kind of scientific movement that's very interested in basically all of the things that we're talking about. The term cybernetics is kind of passé in the empirical social sciences nowadays. It's kind of seen as like a kind of goofy kind of intellectual current of the mid 20th century that was interesting and very profound and fascinating, but it kind of went by the wayside. If we have some time at some point in the semester, we might talk a little bit about the politics of why that is. Anyway, not to get distracted. A difference that makes a difference is what Gregory Bateson defined information as. And so what this immediately sort of should kind of clarify for you is that for something to count as information, it has to actually it has to exert some change on what you currently thought about things. That's one of the basic kind of key criteria for something to actually be information. Okay, so think about like basic small talk, like chit chat. It's perfectly possible to have a whole conversation where like no information is exchanged. Just because you're saying words doesn't mean you're emitting information. Just because you're writing something doesn't mean there's information in it. If you're only telling me things that I know, you're not giving me information. That's just redundancy. Okay, noise in some sense. It's sort of in some sense, the opposite of information is noise, or a difference that doesn't make a difference. Okay, so that's kind of the simplest way to think about it. A little bit more technically, it decreases randomness, or what you could call entropy or chaos. Basically, one of the ways you know that you have just received some information is if all of the different possibilities of a situation that could be the case all of a sudden decreased, and now only a smaller set of possibilities seems possible. That's another kind of sign that you're dealing with information. Okay, so if you listen to the podcast with Sam Harris and David Krakauer, he gives a very nice example of this with the example of maps. Right, so like if I tell you, go to my house in Southampton, it's downtown, meet me at my house right now. Just go find my house downtown. What would you do with no information? All you could do is drive around randomly, right? All you could do is go downtown and go up and down every street looking for the house that has the sign on it that says Justin Murphy's house. That would take you so long, right? That's chaos. That sucks. That's randomness, okay? If I give you a map to my house, and you're able to go straight to my house by following the map, you can think of a measure of the information contained in the map would be the amount of time that map saved you. Okay, so now we have a kind of informal, almost, properly kind of quantifiable measure of what information is. It's basically the difference between the random, chaotic time that you would spend in state A versus the much shorter time you would spend in state B with that piece of information. That's what makes it information. That's its information kind of content. Okay. Contrast information with noise. I kind of just talked about that. Noise is kind of like the opposite of information, right? If instead of giving you a map, while you were driving around Southampton randomly looking for Justin Murphy's house, I was just sort of telling you about the history of Gregory Bateson. That's not going to help you get to my house, right? It might be information in some other context, but in this context, in this system that you're in, It's not information. It's actually worse than information. It's noise. It's actually like distracting you. And every time you're listening to what I say about Gregory Bateson, you're actually, it's harder for you to find my house, okay? So that's kind of what we think of, that's what we call noise. It's sort of extraneous signals that are actually getting in the way of you doing what you're trying to do. Yeah, real quick, just a point on that is typically information has to be extracted from noise. So like data, what you might call data, just raw data, is some combination of noise and the information that you want. Right? So if I just give you a data set and ask you to try to find a pattern in it, well, a lot of it is noise. So to find a real pattern, you have to come up with ways of extracting like what is the real information out of that larger mess of noise, okay? So for those of you who took my Pair 1005 module on scientific method, there's actually a very close link here. Because what we do with statistics is basically it's all about kind of the science of how do you extract the real signal from a data set and remove the noise in some sense. You can think that's what proper scientific method is when you apply it to a data set, okay? The most elementary unit of information is the bit, which a lot of you would have heard before, given our kind of contemporary digital culture. You probably have heard before that, you know, all digital technology kind of runs on zeros and ones, right? I think this is kind of, you know, you see this sort of reference in popular culture. That is basically what the bit is. So the bit is basically, it's just the difference between like an on and off switch. The most elementary kind of particle of information is just, it's like the answer to a yes or no question. You kind of can't get more refined than that. So like the atom is like the basic bit of you know, the physical universe. You know, the bit is basically the atom in the world of information. Okay. In a closed system, information decreases with time. Or another way of putting that is that entropy increases. Now that might sound, you know, very abstract, but we'll see in a few slides later. It's actually super profound if you think about it, and really quite interesting. Because what this last bullet point is saying is that, in some sense, time itself, like what we think of as time, what we know of as time, is really only time because information decreases and randomness increases in general, as a general feature of most things. Okay, so really think about what that means. What it means is that when you create something, it's always tending to breakage, isn't it? Like, you know, you can make this nice, intelligent, correctly formed, functioning PowerPoint clicker, but eventually it's gonna wear down, right? It's gonna break. It's gonna, if I drop it in water, it's over. If I drop it on the ground, it smashes into a bunch of pieces. Even if you just put it on a shelf and wait, you know, 1,000 years, it's gonna, you know, like everything in the world tends to break down over time, right? You can see that some more clearly with certain things. Than other things, food rots, right? Even just the most basic things like your room. Like you clean your room one day, you know, a week later, it's going to be a little bit less clean because you're living in it, because things are happening. So this is kind of like a feature of the universe, okay? That when you install order or information, when you organize something, the passage of time brings decay, it brings randomness, it brings chaos, and it tends to breakage, okay? And that is basically a decrease of information. Think about it like if you clean your room and you organize everything perfectly, that's like a high information kind of situation. Like you know where everything is the way you can think about it. There's nothing going on in that system that you can't map out and understand exactly. A week later, there's gonna be sticky notes sitting in some random place you didn't intend them to be. There's gonna be dust that you never even thought about all of a sudden covering a book. You know, there's gonna be spilled drink that you didn't notice came out of one of your cups while you were moving through the room. That's all chaos. That's all entropy. But what it means, so that's obvious, right? But what's important to see is that that's also a decrease in information. The randomness is increasing. The information that you have about the situation is actively decreasing. So this might seem very abstract and weird, but it really matters because the tendency for entropy and randomness to increase affects every single thing we do. And in some sense, it's why life is so hard. You know, like why is it so hard to be disciplined? Why is it so hard to keep your room clean? It's not because you're lazy or stupid. It's because the universe is kind of organized against you in some basic sense. And the reason this matters is that how do I put this? Something like in what we call intelligence or rationality, what those things have to do with is optimizing the strategies that we use to actually create things that work, okay? That actually last over time, trying to solve these puzzles, okay? We'll talk more about that, but I think that basically, this is my kind of quick and dirty kind of explanation and summary of what exactly information is, okay? It's not it's not at all obvious if you don't think about these things. Okay. These are just kind of some thought experiments that help you kind of think through that if what I just said wasn't clear enough. If you toss a bunch of bricks off of a truck, what do you expect is going to happen to those bricks? How are they going to land? Are they going to land like that? No, of course not, right? That's order. That doesn't happen by chance. They're going to land in a random pile. And so another way to think about that, why is that? It's because disorder is more probable than order. Okay? So probability is yet another way to kind of link up what we're talking about into other terms that you might be familiar with. If you think about like why this is, it's basically just because there are many, many ways to be wrong, but there's only one way to be right in some sense. So it's always going to be more likely that disorder is the outcome of things. That's why things tend to disorder. Okay. It gets a little bit more interesting when you think about time's arrow, because basically time's arrow, our experience that time moves in a linear fashion, that's actually only because randomness increases over time. So let's try to explain what this means. If you look at this situation, if the particles represent gas molecules at normal temperatures inside a closed container, which of the following of these two states came first? It's obvious, right? Which one came first? You would never see a situation where all the molecules start out random and just suddenly move on their own accord into this like tightly ordered structure. No, of course not. You know that this one came first because somehow this order was imposed, and over time that order decays into randomness. Now, here's where this gets super deep and kind of crazy, folks. This is basically the only way we know what time even is. So, like, you all think that time moves forward, right? We all sort of assume and we act as if time moves forward. And in some sense, that's how we experience it. But why? How do you know time moves forward? How do you know time doesn't move backwards? In some sense, it's only because you know that your room is going to be a little bit more disorganized tomorrow than it was today. In some sense, that's how we track time. That's how we know things are moving forward in time. Is that randomness is increasing. Entropy is increasing. In some sense, that is the only... So, another way to think about that is, if you record a video of me breaking a glass bottle, or breaking this PowerPoint clicker. If you record a video of me dropping it on the ground and it crashes into a million pieces, you feel intuitively that time is moving forward from this thing being whole to this thing being smashed into a million pieces. You've never in your life seen a clicker and a million pieces on the ground all of a sudden move forward in time into a whole clicker. You've never in your life seen that ever, because it doesn't happen. So that it's only that feature of the universe that allows us to think that time moves forward. The tendency for things to decay and for randomness to increase. That's how we know. That's the only reason we feel like time moves forward. Now, the reason this is so crazy is because what it means, in some sense, is that when you use your intelligence to create something, to create order out of chaos in any way whatsoever, and that order persists for even 5 minutes, if you can create something where randomness is not increasing, it's basically like time travel. It's like a little cut in the universe in which time is not moving forward. That's what like an intelligent, stable structure is. It's basically erecting a device against the movement of time. And that is why it's so hard, like I was saying before. Why is it so hard to wake up every morning and do your homework and do your readings and work on your essay day after day in a disciplined way? Why is that so hard? It's because you're bearing on your shoulders the weight of the world's chaos. You're doing work. You're investing energy in preventing time from destroying you. That's basically what it means to exercise intelligence. Okay? And that's why this is so not only important, but just fucking crazy. What is communication? Just like information, it's not at all obvious. This is a kind of formal model of what communication is. Okay? So this, by the way, is from work by a famous kind of mathematician and scientist named Claude Shannon. And this is from his very famous paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which was published in 1948. And he's known for basically being kind of the guy who puts the scientific and mathematical nature of information kind of on the map. This is a discovery that's actually only made around the 1950s. Okay, so up until just a few decades ago, we didn't even really know what the hell information was in a really precise mathematical way. It's only because of this kind of formal mathematical grounding of what information is and what communication is that you're able to see things like the internet and cable television. Like the World Wide Web, is run through cables that run through like underneath the fucking oceans. Like there are cables going from the US to the UK, and the internet runs through that. How the hell did they figure it out? Well, they figured it out because they know how information works now, more precisely than ever. So what that's enabled people to do is package it and manipulate it in the most insanely powerful and effective ways, in a nutshell. Anyway, okay, so what's going on here in this model? It's pretty simple, really, isn't it? There's some source of information, but to get that to someone else, you need to put it into some kind of transmitter. Okay? That's the message. You need to encode the message. Then you need to send it off through some sort of pathway to a receiver, and then that receiver has to decode the message, and then they get kind of the final product that the sender was trying to send. But always, and by definition, whenever you're trying to communicate with someone, you have to cross some sort of noisy channel. There's always extraneous information. So this might sound like, it's kind of like playing up or formalizing the obvious. But it's actually not at all obvious, because a lot of us basically we go through life thinking that we just tell, if we want to tell someone what we think, we just tell them what we think, right? But no, that's actually not at all what we do. That's not what we do. It just isn't. We have something that we want to express, and then we have to encode it in a cipher. We do this every day. That's what language is. We have to take what we're feeling, what we want to say or do or get across, and we need to find symbols that the other person is going to interpret in a way that we are trying to predict, and then we need to send them those signals. But guess what? Those words that we send to communicate what we're trying to express, they also make the receiver think about a bunch of other things, right? So if you ask me, you know, how I'm doing, and I want to communicate to you the state of how I'm actually doing, I might say to you, what I'm actually thinking in my mind is, you know, oh, well, I'm kind of happy, but I'm also kind of sad. I'm actually really anxious about, you know, how this person is going to judge me, but I don't know how to really, you know, get that across. But of course, you know, you don't want to give people in normal life these like ridiculous kind of neurotic rants like I just described. So, you know, I might say, yeah, I'm pretty good, but I'm a little anxious about something coming up. Well, okay, you might think, no problem, straight, clear-cut communication. That I told them exactly what was going on in my mind. But no, I didn't, because the word anxious, the words are multidimensional things, right? Like, if I say I'm anxious, that might make you think that I have an anxiety disorder. And you think that actually what I'm telling you is that I have a serious mental health problem. So I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to say I feel a little bit anxious. But you could very well interpret it as me meaning that I have a mental health problem. That possibility of misinterpretation, that's noise. That's noise in the system. We are always communicating through noisy systems. Words are embedded with noise. Okay? So this isn't just a technical thing. It's a super, super concrete thing that applies to the most basic everyday interactions, okay? All right. So that's the basic kind of formal model of what communication entails. There's always noise. So one implication of that is that you can, you know, separate out your signal from the noise more or less effectively, right? And what does it mean? You know, if you've ever met someone who's very articulate, what does that mean to say someone is articulate? It means they have a skillful use of language that is good at minimizing the noise and increasing kind of the information fidelity of their transmissions. Okay, so it's kind of like it's like a form of intelligence, actually, like verbal intelligence or verbal fluidity. You can think about it in these terms as being high on signal and low on noise. We're always trying to increase the signal and always trying to decrease the noise. Okay, and the basic reason why this discovery is so important is because once you get all of this on mathematical grounding, then super smart people can go to work figuring out how to completely revolutionize the material world through this process. And that's exactly what happened. The only way you're able to get the internet to run through cables going through the ocean is by suddenly, all of a sudden, understanding the nature of information versus noise and this whole dynamic so properly and scientifically that you're able to encode like extraordinary volumes of information in like tiny little material spaces. Okay, that's why what we call the information revolution was so significant, is because our ability to send data, to send information from one channel to the next. You know, this is obviously not just about conversation. It's about the internet. It's about cable. It's about TV. You know, all of it is kind of packed into this kind of formal model. Okay, that this formal model of communication is what allows us, you know, all of our digital kind of media technologies. Okay, that's why we're going into it. Okay, we'll go for just a few more minutes, and I'll let you go for a 10-minute break. Right, like I said, that clock's right. Yeah, we have 5 minutes till 4. Yeah, hang tight. We'll take a break in 5 minutes. Right. So, what is rationality? Basically, there are two types of rationality. I mean, I would argue there are two types of rationality, or in this class, we're going to focus on two types of rationality. People have made lots of different arguments about rationality. So what I'm going to say is not, you know, it's not set in stone, but it's just a way of presenting what I think are the most relevant, for our purposes, types of rationalities. The first one is instrumental rationality. And instrumental rationality is basically just, you know, you can think of it as the consistency between the approach that you take to a problem and the goal that you're seeking in kind of the problem situation. Or, you know, are you selecting the right means given a certain end that you have? Okay? So, if you want to find my house, if your goal is to find my house in downtown Southampton, there are more or less rational ways to do that. So, like, asking me what my address is, that's pretty rational. That would give you like a one straight answer. It would quickly and efficiently reach the goal that you have, right? Driving around in a car with no idea where you're going, hoping to find a sign that says Justin Murphy's house, that's not very rational, or it's relatively less rational from an instrumental perspective. It's not instrumentally going to get you what you want very well, okay? So that instrumental word is basically all about how well something that you're doing is going to get you some other thing that you want, okay? Substantive rationality, on the other hand, is not about, the optimal selection of means to reach some end, but it's about, is what you're doing consistent with larger values that are important to you? So, if you want to find where my house is, asking me is a pretty straightforward, quite rational way to do it, as opposed to just driving around like random, which is instrumentally irrational. But on your way to my house, you might be asking yourself, why the hell am I trying to find Justin's house? And if you don't have a very good reason, then it's not very substantively rational, okay? So basically, substantive rationality just refers to kind of the intrinsic value of what it is you're doing. If what you're doing has a kind of strong, significant consistency with what you actually value in a larger sense, then it's substantively rational. And these are two types of rationality that, in fact, are sometimes quite at odds. And in fact, what I'm going to try to kind of put to you is that one of the whole problems with our contemporary kind of organization of society, call it whatever you want, call it capitalism, call it whatever, but one of the major problems with modern life is that it's super instrumentally rational. Our institutions are really instrumentally rational. Like, capitalism is a kind of genius, evolved system for on the level of instrumental rationality, in the sense that it delivers to people almost anything that we've ever dreamed of. Capitalism is able to, capitalism has sort of evolved its production. That's super instrumentally valuable. It can get us, whatever we need to, reach the ends that we seek. But what happens is that all of a sudden, it's so instrumentally rational, it's so instrumentally useful and powerful, that millions of people find themselves in jobs where they literally have no idea why they're doing the work that they're doing, and their life feels meaningless, and it feels like it has absolutely no larger value to it. A lot of people in modern life kind of suffer from this problem, and so that's a lack of. So basically, what you could say, and what I would say, what a lot of people would say, this is a kind of long-standing way of understanding kind of the nature of modern economic life, is that it's high on instrumental rationality, but it's devastatingly low on substantive rationality. In other words, capitalism delivers the goods, but it makes no fucking sense at an abstract general level. You see this with something like global warming, right? Like, do we want an economic system that is like actively overheating the globe? Probably not. That doesn't seem like very substantively rational. It's not very consistent with our larger values and what we'd actually like in the long run. But we are all doing it anyway, and we can't stop doing it because we have basically been kind of overtaken by instrumental rationality. We want to go to work because we need to make money, because we want to, have food, because we want to survive. That's all instrumental rationality. We kind of live purely in instrumental rationality at the cost of our substantive rationality. I'll tell you why that matters after a short 10-minute break. Right. Okay, so this is where we left off. Right. So as I described, we can broadly think of two different types of rationality. The instrumental rationality, which is basically involves optimizing the means that you select to get something that you want, versus substantive rationality, which is about simply doing what is consistent with larger values. So the first one is a kind of like optimizing, maximizing, calculating sort of thing, and the second one is a kind of more holistic, substantive consistency with what you believe, basically. And in some sense, like, they can even be opposites in the sense that, often what we want substantively is not, is everything okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What we want substantively is actually not very instrumental, right? So like maybe you are really good at computer programming, but you just find it makes you so miserable, and it's not your vision of a good life to be a computer programmer. So you could go to Silicon Valley and make loads of money, but it's inconsistent with your values, or maybe you're like an anti-capitalist and you want to do something else and you don't want to participate in Silicon Valley, so you choose to do something that is more consistent with your values, but you're actually losing money to do it, right? So that's like these are the tensions between kind of instrumental rationality and substantive rationality. Okay, so following from that, I want to argue that basically there are two types of communication. There are probably multiple types of communication, but two that I find most relevant that I want to kind of talk about. And as far as I know, people have said things kind of like this before. Obviously, everything is borrowed from, previous thinkers on some level. But this is basically as far as I know, this is kind of like, this is just the way I've been thinking about it. And this is something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. Because basically, the reason I've been thinking about this for a long time, and the reason I think it matters, is because if I am right that this sort of conflict between instrumental rationality and substantive rationality is one of the kind of defining problems of modern life, especially because, kind of as I was saying before, capitalism is this kind of like instrumental machine, and it's quite brutal with respect to actual substantive rationality. It's very substantively irrational capitalism. If that is true, and this correctly characterizes kind of one of our biggest predicaments with life today, then what has for a long time seemed to me to be the case is that we have like a direct way of accessing this problem, this sort of like oppressive structure. Basically, I think like you can think of this as a kind of oppressive structure that fucks up most modern people. We have like a direct way to kind of hack it, if you will, to kind of resist it or enter into it and rewire it in ways that I think could potentially, really open the door to fundamentally more liberating modes of like political activity. I think we do have direct access to rewiring this oppressive structure that bears down upon us. And I think my hypothesis is that it has something to do with communication, and in particular like how we communicate even just with each other. Because what you see, I think, in contemporary modern life, in large part because of the way that our system is organized, and because of this sort of super intelligent, complex organism that directs, our energies, for most people around the world, because we live in that sort of situation, most of our communication with each other is instrumental communication, what I would call instrumental communication. So that's sort of the first type of communication that I want to kind of distinguish for you today. And basically, my idea of what I call instrumental communication is basically whenever we are, sending signals out to people around us. Yes?
Sorry, the ball's not on.
Oh, thank you so much. People, what took you so long? Come on. Thank you, and I'm sorry about that, folks. You're all very polite, respectful listeners. Didn't want to hurt my feelings and tell me that I forgot to turn the board on, but next time, speak up. Thank you for finally telling me. Okay. So yes. So broadly, I think there are two types of communication, and the first one is what I would call instrumental communication. So what is that exactly? It basically is when we use signals, language, whatever, in such a way to get something that we want. Okay, so it's basically just instrumental rationality applied to communication, or rather, an instrumentally rational form of communication. Okay, it's characterized by what we would call extrinsic motivation, meaning we're doing, like, it's a type of communication that we do to get something else. That's what extrinsic motivation means. It means like the reward, the goal, the purpose of what you're doing is something outside of itself. Okay, that's what extrinsic means. That's what extrinsic motivation is. Another characterization of instrumental communication is that it's actually a way of manipulating the world, right? So in instrumental communication, you're talking to someone not to like express some deep inner truth that you have or feel, but because you're trying to make them think differently or act differently, or you're trying to manipulate something, or maybe you're trying, so like in a lecture, for instance, right? Like, obviously I'm trying to teach you, I'm trying to share with you my knowledge, I'm trying to give you the most sort of interesting, empowering kind of insight into the world that I possibly can, and I'm doing that because I believe in it, because, there's some substantive values there for sure, and it's good to do, and I believe in that. But on some basic level, everything we do is also kind of mixed in with these instrumental concerns. Like, I want you to think that I'm smart, right? I want you to like me, I want you to like respect me, I want you to, give me good evaluations at the end so that I get a raise and I get promoted, right? Those are all instrumental concerns, right? So the way that I'm speaking to you right now in this, so like when I come into a lecture hall and I give you this lecture, obviously I'm trying to transmit to you information that I believe is true, but I'm also trying to influence how you see me, right? For my own ulterior motives, right? And on some level, all social interactions have at least like some sort of substrate of instrumental dimension. And I mean, for you all, for undergraduate students, I mean, I suspect almost all of your communication is loaded with instrumental concerns. Like when you go to a party and you talk to people, and then, by the way, this is not a critique, this is just like what people do. It's the nature of social communication in some sense. Like when you go to a party and you find yourself in a conversation with someone at a party, are you trying to like reflect to them as clearly as possible like the truth of your soul? No, of course not. You're like trying to get laid and shit like that. That's instrumental. You're choosing words to get something that you're trying to do. You want to make people like you. You want to make people think you're cool. You want to show people that you're smart. And that's all like a kind of natural part of social life. But the point is to be able to break down communication into these two different components. And you can be doing more or less of your communication can have more or less of this instrumental component. Now, I think one of the things that's so perverse about capitalism is that in a capitalist society, you're sort of pressured and encouraged to do this at like a really, I think, disgusting level, right? So like the kind of the trope of the like overly ambitious kind of like social networker type of person, like you go to a dinner party or something like that, and they're just like trying to chat you up because they want to, give you their business card, and they want to, use you for some like business deal in the future or something like that. They want to like build their cultural capital, right? So for many people today, like even their social life is basically reduced to kind of instrumental maneuvering, where like all the conversations they have in their entire life basically boils down to like trying to kind of strategically manipulate how people see them for their own kind of personal interests somewhere down the line. Okay, and in some sense, this is not because people are bad people. I mean, there are some people who are bad people, but this is not primarily because these people aren't evil who do this. This tendency isn't evil. It's cultivated by living in a capitalist society where like you have to effectively present yourself in an instrumental way to be able to get jobs and to get respect and to get money, basically, to survive, right? So it's a complex product of living in this sort of hyper-competitive society. Okay, so that's what I mean by strategic manipulation or signaling. You might have heard of the term like virtue signaling. This is kind of like a popular idea right now because you go onto Twitter or something like that. Like the overwhelming majority of people on Twitter are doing instrumental communication. Like they're not trying to share information with the world because like that's just maybe some people are, but for the most part, like most people go on Twitter not because they're like, okay, I have this like unique piece of information, I need the world to find out this true piece of information. Like that is not what people do on Twitter by and large. Like an overwhelming majority of people go on something like Twitter to signal the type of person that they are so that other people like them. That's like the game of most like social media. That's 99% of what people are posting on social media, is to like manipulate how people see them and feel about them, right? Okay. Delayed gratification is another sort of characteristic of instrumental communication, and what I mean by that is like with all types of instrumental activity, one of the things that stands out about that is like what you're doing in that moment. It's never about what you're doing in that moment. It's always about something you're trying to get in the future. Okay, so that's why sometimes like socializing can be so alienating and exhausting when like you're just in this competitive kind of environment where everyone is trying to convince each other that they're cool, and everyone's trying to get laid, and everyone's trying to be like the smarter, like more interesting, more attractive person. Like there's a reason why that can be so. Sometimes it can be fun, whatever. If you're winning that game, that can be fun, maybe. But for like most people, most of the time, that shit gets really annoying and really kind of empty and alienating. And why is it? It's because in that moment, you're all like fighting for some like reward that comes down the line. But you're not actually enjoying the truth of who you are. You're not actually like enjoying the moment. You're not actually just being who you are and being together and enjoying that moment. Okay, so that's what I mean by delayed gratification. And that's one thing that characterizes instrumental communication. And finally, there's a kind of cost minimizing logic. So like when we're engaged in instrumental communication, it's not always conscious, but the thought process is like, so if I want to signal to someone, if I'm at a party or something, or I'm on social media and I want to signal to someone that I'm intelligent, let's say, right? Like what I'm really thinking when I'm searching for words to try to seem intelligent, what I'm really thinking is like, what is the shortest, most efficient string of syllables I could say that is going to get me like the greatest amount of intelligence points in this particular moment? It's a kind of cost minimizing logic. Okay, that's all you need to kind of say about that. These points will become a little bit more clear when I contrast instrumental communication with what I like to call substantive communication, which I think is basically the opposite of instrumental communication in some sense, kind of on each bullet point. So you know that you're engaged in substantive communication when, first of all, you're literally engaged in that communication purely for the joy and the pleasure of that communication. Okay? So there is no extrinsic motivation. There's an intrinsic motivation. Okay? So, like, what would be a good example? A good example of this would be like when you're hanging out with your best friend, as opposed to going to a competitive, like, social party environment, right? So, like, to counterpoint hanging out with your best friend to the competitive social environment, what do you do when you're hanging out with your best friend? Well, you know each other so deeply. You're not trying to one-up each other. You already know. You know how intelligent each other is. You know each other's traits. You're not going to fool each other. You're not going to trick the other person into thinking you're something that you're not, because they know you so well and you know them so well. So you're already transparent about who you actually are. And when you're talking with your best friend, as in a best friend kind of way, you're literally doing it just because it's fun to share that common space, to share that common mental space, to play linguistic games, to make jokes. In some sense, right? So whatever. That's basically what I mean by intrinsic. You're doing it because it is intrinsically valuable, and you believe it is good to do it, and it's immediately satisfying. There's nothing down the road that you're angling towards. Now, no, there can be, and this is super important, there can be instrumentally valuable things that happen down the line from doing substantive activities, like substantive communication, that doesn't necessarily disqualify it. So, for instance, it's very instrumentally valuable to have at least a few really, really close friends. That's really, if you get sick down the line, if you're poor down the line, they can really help you. So that's instrumentally valuable. But the key thing about substantive communication is that you're not doing it for that reason. That's not the actual motivation. You're doing it because it's intrinsically valuable. And here's something that I found so fascinating, and this is something that my mind keeps going back to, and I'm really trying to figure out, is there's this weird way in which if you're doing substantive communication, or you're trying to do substantive communication, but you're actually doing it for instrumental reasons, it doesn't work. It's like the universe knows you're cheating, and it doesn't let you get the benefits of substantive communication. So what do I mean by this? Like, if you have a best friend, you should be able to spend an hour with them at the pub, just talking about anything, talking about each other's feelings, talking about each other's thoughts, whatever. There's absolutely no purpose to it. You should enjoy it because you care about them and they care about you, and that is intrinsically enjoyable situation where there's no other goal but sharing time with your best friend. You should be able to do that. Now, listen, if that's not a part of your life, don't blame yourself. And I'm not criticizing you. Unfortunately, it's a horrifying fact that today, in today's world, actually many people don't have that type of experience on a regular basis. Okay, so that doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't mean doesn't make you a bad person. It's an unfortunate feature of like hyper speed competitive contemporary capitalism that in fact this basic way of relating to each other is actually becoming extinguished. I genuinely fear that this like basic mode of just enjoying each other for no other purpose is literally being eradicated from our basic kind of set of human experiences. Okay, that is my genuine fear, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in kind of marking this out and explaining this difference. Because I think a lot of people genuinely don't have a memory of what it feels like to just be with a really close friend where you're not trying to gain anything and you're not worried about failing in any way. You're just enjoying that kind of like pure being together. Like a lot of people I think don't really even remember ever having that feeling, right? Hopefully some of you do. And for some people it's like they can only remember it in their early childhood. And for many people today, like becoming an adult means like all you do is work and you never have these experiences. And I think that's like a horrifying situation. I think that's why capitalism is so substantively irrational. Like who the fuck wants to live like that? Nobody, I think. And yet that's what we have to, that's how we live. Okay, right, so another character, another kind of aspect of substantive communication is that you're not trying to change something through your words or your communications, but you're just trying to reveal something. So another, aletheia is a Greek word for it's one kind of conception of what the truth means, of what truth is, and it basically means revealing. If you read your Heidegger closely, you might have come across the word aletheia. It basically means, Heidegger uses the word revealing often. You would have noticed if you read it closely. So this is a mode of communicating in which you're not trying to get anything at all. You're not trying to even change anything at all. You're just trying to take something that is relatively disguised or confused, and you're trying to share it. You're trying to bring it into the open, simply because it is. So it's like the truth for truth's sake, basically, is what you're trying to kind of get across in substantive communication. So, one example I gave of substantive communication is like deep, close time with a best friend. The kind of talking that you're able to do uniquely with a best friend, just for fun, just for connection. That's one example. But another example is what I would argue is like legitimate, ideal political speech. So when you express when you actually express yourself politically, I would argue to express yourself politically in a genuine way, it has to be a kind of a substantive communication in which you're not trying to change anyone's mind. You're not trying to like promote a party. You're not even really trying to achieve anything. You're simply trying to take something that is currently not seen, and you're trying to make it seen. So that could be how you think, that could be how you feel, it could be a problem with the world, it could be like something going wrong with the institutions around you. There's some systemic problem that everyone is brushing under the rug because people don't like to deal with real hard problems. Well, when you step up and you tell a group of people, or even just one person, say, I have noticed that there is this thing going on and I believe it is a problem. And you're saying it just because you believe it should be known, because you think it's there and you think that people don't see it. That is, I think, perhaps one of the only genuine and legitimate ethical forms of like political communication, basically. And again, if you look out into the world, like especially social media, right, or the mainstream media, 99.9% of all political communication is instrumental communication, right? So the average politician, every single word out of their mouth, for the most part, is trying to have a calculated effect on someone for some reason. And it might be a good reason, maybe, if it's a politician you'd like or whatever. I'm not even making judgment on that. I'm just trying to paint the difference between instrumental communication versus substantive communication. And another thing that is really fascinating to me is that whenever substantive communication occurs, in precisely because it is so rare under capitalism today, when it occurs, you know it, you feel it. There's this weird kind of thing where when someone is being super sincere and super honest, and they're not trying to get anything from you, but they're trying really hard to show something that they see, just because they see it. It has a way of making itself felt, and I think that's in part because it's so rare. Okay. Right, so it's disinterested revealing instead of strategic manipulation. There's no delayed gratification. It's imminently enjoyable. I think that kind of goes hand in hand with intrinsic or autotelic is a kind of fancy word that comes out of psychology. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the autotelic just means the goal is the thing itself, right? Telic meaning goal, auto meaning self. So there is no other goal. The goal is the thing that you're actually doing itself. Right, and finally, what's weird about substantive communication is that it's actually cost maximizing. So, instrumental speech, the kind of like instrumental social butterfly trying to climb, the ladder for their own kind of power and prestige. They're kind of, they're going to talk to you for the shortest amount of time they possibly can to get what they need from you, right? That's how you can spot a kind of like instrumental social climber who just is using the people around them. They kind of jump around as quickly as they possibly can get away with to get what they need from the different people around them. That's cost minimizing instrumental communication. But what's cool and weird about substantive communication is you almost go out of your way to spend more time than you need to. And isn't that what we do with things like gift giving and spending family time and spending friend time? It's like we actually want to show the other how almost wasteful we're willing to be, as a kind of signal to them that we're not exploiting, we're not trying to get something out of the situation. We actually, because you're my best friend, I can be a little bit late to my job or something like that. Like that's a sign of affection. It's a signal that what you're doing is real in some sense. If you're having a conversation with your best friend and you're like, yeah, this is really nice, but can you finish that thought because I really got to be somewhere else? That clearly kind of breaks the substantive rationality of the whole situation, right? So there's this weird kind of almost cost maximizing tendency to what I would call substantive communication. So interestingly, both of these things they sort of map onto kind of the ideas of substantive rationality as I laid them out a little bit before. And also what's interesting is that these forms of communication have economic kind of qualities. This difference between cost minimizing and cost maximizing speech or communication situations. That's very fascinating because that's basically a kind of economic dimension. And so this seems to be supportive of my kind of hunch that this type of the difference between these types of communication really matters a lot for understanding our current predicament, in which all of us are embedded in a kind of hyper-instrumental system in which it's actually substantively irrational for a large number of us, and perhaps for the species as a whole. Okay, so I won't make this point to you now because we don't have enough time, but to just put a cap on today's lecture and to kind of jog your mind a little bit for the next lecture. One of the paths that I'm going to be pursuing throughout this semester is that I actually think substantive communication, this peculiar type of communication, actually has extraordinary and concrete political effects. That if you do it with one person, if you do it with a group of people, if groups start doing it with other groups, I actually think that is a really concrete pathway through which genuinely radical and revolutionary kind of, if you will, liberatory dynamics can really genuinely be triggered by normal people. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm interested in this, because I think it might be able to answer a lot of the questions about how we might want to change our society. Okay, thank you, everyone.